State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 2250. Will the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Yoder, kindly resume the chair?
This is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 2250, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide additional time for the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to issue achievable standards for industrial, commercial, and institutional boilers, process heaters, and incinerators, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole House rose earlier today, request for recorded vote on Amendment Number 4, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, had been postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in the Congressional Record on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment Number 9 by Mr. Waxman of California. Amendment Number 6 by Mr. Rush of Illinois. Amendment Number 15 by Ms. Hahn of California. Amendment Number 16 by Ms. Capps of California. Amendment Number 4 by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in the series. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on Amendment Number 9, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 9, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House has voted moments ago to table the Jesse Jackson resolution on Rick Perry's hunting camp. That vote there was 231 to 173. Earlier today, by a vote of 262 to 161, they passed a bill that would delay EPA rules cutting toxic air pollution and mercury from cement plants. And then they took up a similar measure dealing with industrial incinerators and boilers. And now they are dealing with 5 amendments to that bill. This first one by Henry Waxman of California. This is a 15-minute vote on the House floor. And during this vote, we're going to take you over to the House Financial Services Committee. They are hearing from Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner. This is his second appearance on Capitol Hill today. He's testifying about the report of the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It's an annual report as mandated by the Dodd-Frank Financial Regulations Overhaul Bill. And we'll show you as much of his testimony as we can as this vote continues.
To make sure that the regulation process was well coordinated. And in fact, I think you said this morning that failure to coordinate rulemaking will be enormously expensive to the economy and create opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. So as the overseer of that process, what are you doing to go above and beyond to get these agencies to coordinate?
Well, under the law that the Congress passed, I was given the responsibility to try to coordinate, but not the authority to force it. So I'm doing what you would expect me to do, which is try to get them together, encourage them to use the discretion they have to be more closely aligned, and make sure it's being sequenced in a sensible way, and make sure they're looking at the full scope of the things we're imposing on the system. Of course, the things we're imposing on the system has costs. And we're trying to make sure that it's done in a way that everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And as you can see, it's a challenge. But you did not give me the authority to compel them to work closely together, and they exist with independent statutes, independent mandates, and they're going to be protective of that. But where they have the flexibility under the law to be more aligned, they're moving closer to being aligned.
Yeah, because I think an example of that was brought up a while ago about the CFTC and the SEC, for particularly on derivatives, and in other words, business conduct standards and margin and capital requirements and clearing. There's obviously not coordination or mutual agreement on those. And obviously those are very important issues to the economy. And I think you make a good point, is that we're not given the authority to compel these agencies. So is this a flawed process? And because as you say, this is maybe the most important thing that can happen here, and important to the economy. And if the process isn't going to work, and we're not going to have harmonization between this rulemaking, then what direction should we be going?
It's a dramatic improvement in the system we had before the law was passed. Dramatic improvement. They're working very closely together. They recognize, if you had them here with me, the people who run the CFTC, the SEC, and the Fed, they'd commit to the same basic objective because they recognize it's important. They have a very elaborate, closely coordinated process to try to make sure that, they're doing this in a sensible sequence. And, you're going to want to see, like we are, where they land the stuff, how closely they get to that stated commitment. But they're committed to it, and I think they're doing a reasonable job. It's a little messy to look at. I agree with that. And we just got to keep emphasizing the importance of it.
If it's not working, or if it's what is the alternative here? I mean, should we elevate this to another level? I hate to bring another bureaucracy in there, but if do we need a referee here?
I don't
a working group?
I don't think you're going to pass a law. You don't need another committee, that's for sure. You got enough committees. You're not going to pass a law that, I don't think, that gives me authority to tell them what to do, and I wouldn't seek that authority. So what we're doing is the best we can with the authority we have, and I think it is working. It's just not, we can't be certain yet it's going to work well enough, but I'd take a more optimistic view.
I think one of the things you said earlier, too, is you're worried about the cumulative burden of the regulations. I'm worried about the cumulative effect of all these regulations. Just the first 102 regulations that came out of Dodd-Frank, for example, according to the regulators themselves, will take 10.8 million hours of compliance. And we did a press conference not too long ago, and you may or may not know this, but you did a little stint in New York. They built the Empire State Building in 7 million man-hours. And so this is just the first 102 rules. I mean, how are we not just suffocating the financial markets, and we've just begun?
I think you're too worried about the cumulative impact of these financial reforms on the basic business of finance in the United States. Now, we're not going to get it perfect, but we saw what happens when you get it wrong, when they're too weak, they're poorly designed, there's huge gaps, we leave a huge amount of stuff to operate in the shadows. We have a chance to fix that now. As I said, and I say this over and over again in public, as we fix it, we want to make sure we don't overdo it. And where we have to get tougher standards in place, like on capital over time, we're going to make sure they're phased in over time so we're not going to hurt the recovery. And I do not believe there is credible evidence to support the conclusion that the rules as they're now being designed are doing material damage to the basic objectives we seek, which is to create a more stable system. Now, they have consequences. They will raise costs of business for financial institutions. That is their objective in some ways, or that's the necessary outcome of that stuff. But we have to get the balance right, and we're being careful to do it.
I think that's the reason that coordination is extremely important, because not only are we seeing a lot of those regulations coming out by multiple agencies, but when we talk to people in the regulated community, they tell you that more coordination is needed. And so I would encourage you, Mr. Secretary, even though you may not be able to compel, but that you spend a tremendous amount of energy to make sure that that process is moving along, because I think it's extremely important to the economy.
Well, thank you for emphasizing the importance of that, and I share your view about the importance, and I am spending more time than you can imagine.
Thank you. Mr. Schweikert.
I wasn't sure someone else was in queue to go ahead of me. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I assume a day like this becomes a long day for you. You were in the Senate this morning.
Not so bad. Sort of good debate to have. Fun to be with you again.
Well, hopefully it's not necessarily a debate. It's an opportunity for us to learn, and hopefully you're well caffeinated. I want to go off on a side issue. I've been trying to learn more about Basel III. and what it affects and how it affects our capital requirements. First question. I see in some articles a discussion of what will be counted as Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 types capitals. Am I under the impression that in Basel III that bonds from Fannie and Freddie would be Tier 2?
I don't think I can answer that, but I'm happy to get back to you in writing. I mean, the fundamental thing we did in Basel III is to basically say for the core minimum capital requirement, we're going to require you to meet it with common equity, not with a bunch of other stuff. That's for the Tier 1 capital requirement. But we do still, regulators do still require allow you to use other forms of capital to meet the additional.
Within that Tier 1? Yeah.
No, in Tier 1, we're essentially limiting it to common. Okay. For all practical purposes, but I'd be happy to respond to you in writing on the details.
Look, this is what I'm trying to educate myself in, because my understanding is sort of like in FSOC, some of the additional premium out there is a couple $100 billion of additional, even beyond what would have been a Basel III requirement.
I've read those reports and the letters of concerns about that, and I do not believe that those estimates are accurate, but I have to talk to the Fed about it. But you're correct to say, in addition to the Basel III threshold, we have proposed, and the law asked us to do this, and I fully support this, that the largest institutions in the world should hold an additional buffer of capital. And the Fed's in the process of negotiating those details with the other their counterparts around the world.
I appreciate it. I'm still trying to hunt for sort of the math that tells me what creates a level of safety, whether at the same time pulls so much capital out of the markets that we actually inhibit economic expansion and growth. And my fear is, are we heading towards a layering where well-intended, but we may be starting to pull too much of that capital away?
I don't think so, and I'll cite that. You're right to say first of all, there's no science to that basic choice.
Yeah, but there's always someone willing to make up a formula.
There is, and you can go too far. I agree with that, but all we know is that they were way too low, and they weren't applied far enough across the system. And we're trying to get them more conservative, so there's much lower probability of failure or default of financial crisis in the future without going too far. If we go too far, what's the consequence of going too far? You're right, you say you put additional burden on the economy, but you also have the effect of just shifting the risk outside the banking system in ways that don't necessarily make us better off. So we're trying to get the balance right for those reasons. My basic sense is that, first of all, U.S. firms on average are very far along to meeting those requirements already, and that it seems, on the basis of the available evidence and what analysts have said independently, that since the remaining requirements will be phased in over a long period of time, that they'll be able to earn their way into those higher requirements. And because of that, we think we can manage this in a way we have limited effect on the recovery that's still, still sort of fragile.
Two other quick things, because I only have about a minute and 20 seconds. I was, in my running back and forth to vote, hearing some of your comments and discussions about mortgages and foreclosures and those. I have to be one of those people that believe we don't drive health back to our residential real estate market until we actually get the glut of non-performing paper, but also of vacant homes. What is it? The estimate is 13% of residential units in the country are functionally vacant. In some places like I represent in Arizona, in Maricopa County, it could be 16% of our residential units. A lot of well-meaning mortgage foreclosure moratoriums and abatements and those things in many ways have actually made the problem worse and last longer. I know that doesn't feel as warm and fuzzy, but ultimately if we're going to bring back our home values, I was somewhat happy to hear the understanding saying, look, we got to grind through this. We got to, what isn't performing, we have to get to move into some status of performing.
Well, I think much of what you said is right, that we won't do the system any good if we leave those broader foreclosure systems as broken and frozen as they are. And in many ways, the best thing you can do for those communities is to get those vacant properties into better hands, into rental or other uses. That would help as a whole. But there is still a very strong argument, economic argument, financial argument, fairness argument, that you want to make sure people that have income, can afford to stay in their homes if they're given a chance, are able to do that. And we're trying to help that. And I think in helping that, I don't think we're getting in the way of the necessary adjustment that has to happen in the market.
And I know I'm literally over time, but you've hit something that concerns me. And actually, this is one I actually give Fannie and Freddie some credit for. You know, some of their servicing best practices they've put out in the last couple of months actually seem to do that mechanic. If we can get you there, we can keep you in the home and work those out, we're going to get you there. If you can't, then we cannot let this slow, decay of foreclosure linger. And it's sort of, you have to hit a decision point and actually make that tough decision, but you've got to make it.
What we try to do is to say that, some people need to be given some help through a short sale or a deed in lieu of sale to transition in some ways. And so we've had a mix of approaches across the system. But as you know, the servicing framework is still fundamentally broken. The securitization system makes it much harder for that to happen on the scale you need to.
And Secretary, I would love if you also have a staffer. You hit on one thing. I'm a fan, and we've been trying to write now for a couple months the concept of do a deed in lieu to a lease back to maybe even a down payment IRA, so in future you could actually buy the property back. Some of those mechanics, and actually, believe it or not, we keep running into sort of regulatory hurdles and within those concepts because you're having to do 3 or 4 very different things all at once. If you have someone that intellectually has been working on that, I'd love to spend some time.
Happy to do that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your tolerance.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your testimony today. I want to end on a positive note. You made a speech June of this year when you said there is a very strong case for requiring the largest firms to hold more capital relative to risk than smaller institutions, and I agree with that. But you also asked that day how much, which is, I think, a very important question. You said in making this judgment, the central banks and supervisors need a balance between setting capital requirements high enough to provide strong cushions against loss, but not so high to drive the reemergence of a risky shadow banking system. And my question is, with, say, Basel III capital rules combined with all the rules imposed by Dodd-Frank, whether they're good or bad or neutral, will there be at least a tendency, a shift from the banking system or the banking sector to a less regulated, what we call a shadow banking system?
Well, we always have to be worried about the risk, but I don't believe that is likely on the strength of the rules we see coming into place today. But we're going to be very attentive to that for the reasons you said.
All right, great. I appreciate that. A significant move away from financial activity in highly regulated financial institutions into less regulated sectors, how would that affect financial stability, or how could it?
Well, it could be very damaging, as we saw what some people call the shadow financial system or the parallel financial system.
The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on Amendment Number 6, printed in the Congressional Record by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This is the second of 5 amendment votes to a bill that would delay EPA regulation of emissions from industrial boilers and incinerators. Bobby Rush's amendment would add language to the bill stating that the contents of the bill don't supersede or limit any requirement of the Clean Air Act. 4 more amendment votes after this, and we expect the House to resume more debate on amendments to the bill after that.
On this vote, the yeas are 156, the nays are 242, and the amendment is lost. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on amendment number 15, printed in the congressional record and offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Hahn, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
15, printed in the congressional record, offered by Ms. Hahn of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
Janice Hahn's amendment would require that regulations blocked by the bill stay in effect for any boiler located in any of the 10 metropolitan areas of the U.S. with the worst air quality. This is a 2-minute vote, one of 5 amendment votes to a bill which would delay EPA regulation of emissions from industrial boilers and incinerators. Earlier today, the House passed a similar measure dealing with cement plants that passed by a vote of 262 to 161. We expect after this series of votes, this will be the last series of recorded votes on the House floor this week.
On this vote, the yeas are 151, the nays are 255, and the amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on amendment number 16, printed in the congressional record and offered by the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Capps, on which further proceedings were postponed, and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 16, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is in order. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
The underlying legislation seeks to delay EPA rules to cut toxic air pollution and mercury from solid waste incinerators and industrial boilers. Lois Capps' amendment would state that if the regulations in the that are preempted by the bill are permitted to go into effect, the cost benefits. She details the cost benefits of allowing the regulations to go into effect. That's what her amendment deals with. One more amendment vote after this, but the House is not finished with this legislation today and probably won't until early next week. We expect this to be the final series of recorded votes on the House floor of this week. Over in the Senate, meanwhile, they continued debate on the Chinese currency bill. They agreed to limit debate earlier today. They invoked cloture. That was a 62-38 vote. And debate continues. Senator Kerry on the floor now. You can follow that on C-SPAN 2. It's possible that the Senate will complete work on that bill today.
On this vote, the yeas are 153, the nays are 253, and the motion is...
Mr. Sutherland. Mr. Sutherland votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 153, the nays are 254, and the motion is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on amendment number 4, printed in the Congressional Journal and offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
Final amendment vote in this series on a bill, an amendment by Representative Doyle of Pennsylvania to a bill that blocks the EPA from implementing new restrictions and rules on emissions from incinerators, and industrial boilers. This is a 2-minute vote, and this again will be the last in this series and the last recorded vote of the week in the House.
On this vote, the yeas are 147, the nays are 251, with 1 voting present. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye, and all those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2250, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
Okay. The Chairman of the Committee, the Whole House on the State of the Union, reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2250 and has come to no resolution thereon.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the Speaker for a moment and to say that on roll call 765, I, along with Mr. Hoyer, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Mr. Crowley, and Mr. Smith, other members were present at the decommissioning ceremony of Commander Mark Kelly. We were there with his wife, our colleague, Gabby Giffords, and for that reason, we missed that roll call vote. For myself, had I been present, I would have voted no on the motion to table the resolution. I would have voted yes on the Waxman bill to protect our children from mercury, and I would have voted yes on Mr. Rush's, that would be 766 for Mr. Waxman, 767 for Mr. Rush's amendment, for which I would have voted yes. With that,
Without objection,
do I speak for the others? My colleague, the distinguished Democratic whip, says that he and Mrs. Wasserman Schultz would have voted similarly.
Without objection,
thank you.
Be noted in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. For all purposes, the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 425, resolution providing for consideration of the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 2832 to extend a generalized system of preferences and for other purposes, providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3078 to implement the United States-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement, providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3079 to implement the United States-Panama Trade Promotion Agreement, and providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3080 to implement the United States-Korea Free Trade Agreement.
Refer to the House calendar and ordered printed. For purposes, gentleman from Maryland rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute for the purposes of inquiring of the Majority Leader, the schedule for the week to come.
Without objection.
I thank the Speaker, and I yield to my friend, the Majority Leader, Mr. Cantor from Virginia.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the House is not in session in observation of the Columbus Day holiday. On Tuesday, the House will meet at noon for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and noon for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. Last votes of the week are expected no later than 3 p.m. Friday. On Tuesday, the House will consider a few bills under suspension of the rules. A complete list will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. Also on Tuesday, the House will complete action on H.R. 2250, the EPA Regulatory Relief Act, and take up the rule for the 3 trade agreements and trade adjustment assistance bill. Therefore, members are advised that the 6:30 p.m. vote series will be longer than usual. On Wednesday, the House will consider H.R. 3078, the United States-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement Implementation Act, H.R. 3079, the United States-Panama Trade Promotion Agreement Implementation Act, H.R. 3080, the United States-Korea Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act, and H.R. 2832, extending the generalized system of preferences as amended by the Senate. On Thursday, the House will consider H.R. 358, the Protect Life Act, sponsored by Representative Joe Pitts. And finally, on Friday, the House will consider H.R. 2273, the Coles Residual Reuse and Management Act, sponsored by Representative Dave McKinley of West Virginia. The Boiler Mac bill, 3 free trade agreements, and Mr. McKinley's regulatory relief bill are all part of the House Republican plan for America's job creators. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his information. Before I talk about the American Jobs Act, Does the Majority Leader have an estimate from either CBO or any economist on how many bills over the next how many jobs over the next 24 months, the bills to which you refer as the House Republican Plan for American Jobs Creators? Do you have any information on how many jobs might be created in the next 24 months as a result of the passage of those bills?
Mr. Speaker, I say to the gentleman I'm very entertained by the nature of his question, since I guess it starts from the fact that some might believe that Congress creates jobs. But I would say in general to the Speaker that what we need to be doing here is to create an environment where entrepreneurs and small businesses and investors can actually feel confident again to put capital to risk to create jobs. I would say to the gentleman further that the administration itself has accepted the notion that passage of the 3 free trade agreements will have the potential, there's no guarantee, but potential of the creation of 250,000 jobs. Again, there have been a lot of promises made in this town, Mr. Speaker, about how we're going to control the level of unemployment and make sure it doesn't go beyond certain points connected with the stimulus bill. And I think the American people have had just about enough of broken promises. So we are proceeding with a focus like a laser on creating an environment for entrepreneurs and small businesses to create jobs without making promises, Mr. Speaker, that will then let people down. We're trying to regain the confidence of the people, put some sensible regulatory policy in place, lower tax environment, so we can see growth return to a badly needed macroeconomic environment. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for that answer. What I took from that answer is there is no estimate of jobs that might be created in the next 24 months. That's what I took from your answer. In terms of not creating jobs but creating an environment, I agree with the gentleman that we need to create an environment for jobs, but I don't believe that I've seen any estimates that your agenda will create jobs. As a matter of fact, I've seen the opposite. Mr. Bruce Bartlett, former advisor to President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, was quoted just a few days ago. I know the gentleman's smiling because he knows this quote. And I quote, "Republicans have a problem. People are increasingly concerned about unemployment, but Republicans have nothing to offer them." Mr. Bartlett said, not me. The GOP opposes additional government spending for jobs pros and, in fact, favors big cuts in spending that Mr. Bartlett said would be likely to lead to further layoffs at all levels of government. He goes on to say Republicans favor tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, but these had no stimulative effect during the George W. Bush administration. Of course, we lost 8 million jobs, as the gentleman recalled, during that period of time, and there is no reason to believe that more of them will have any today. He goes on to say, and the Republicans' oft-stated concern for the deficit makes tax cuts a hard sell. On August 29th, the House Majority Leader, yourself, Mr. Cantor of Virginia, sent a memorandum to members of the House Republican Congress telling them to make the repeal of job-destroying regulations. This is Mr. Bartlett, former Reagan aide and former aide to George H.W. Bush, both Republican presidents, goes on to say, evidence supporting Mr. Cantor's contention that deregulation would increase unemployment is very weak, said Mr. Bartlett. As one can see, the number of layoffs nationwide caused by government regulation is minuscule, according to Mr. Bartlett, and shows no evidence of getting worse during the Obama administration. Mr. Reagan was quoted. We have a nice quote, I'm sure you've seen it, that indicates that people ought to pay their fair share of taxes as well. The President has offered the American Jobs Act. He's offered the American Jobs Act, and economist after economist after economist says that it will create jobs. It will create jobs by creating an environment, by giving more money to small businesses, giving more money to consumers in their pocket. I know your side's talked a lot about that, and that as a result of both businesses having more money in its pocket and consumers having more money in their pocket, that environment of which you speak will be created. And A number of people think that they will create significant numbers of jobs as a result. As a matter of fact, the macroeconomic advisors projected the plan would add roughly 1.25 percentage points to GDP, to gross domestic product, and create 1.3 million jobs. J.P. Morgan Chase estimated the plan would increase growth by almost 2 points and add 1.5 million jobs. Moody's Analytics forecast that the package would add almost 2 million jobs, 1.9 million jobs, cutting the unemployment rate by a point and increase growth by 2 percentage points. Now, I know my friend may disagree with those figures and may disagree with Mr. Bartlett's comment. I'm sure you do. My point is this. We don't have any bill on the floor that we've had over the last 9 months or that is projected to increase jobs in the short term. Now, the gentleman knows he and I agree on the trade bills. I think long term that's correct. But the American people, as President Obama observed, can't wait 14 months for the next election. They are struggling, in pain, and at risk today. And the gentleman last week, or 2 weeks ago in our colloquy, said that there are a number of things, items in the jobs bill with which the gentleman agrees or his party agrees. Bonus depreciation, incentives for veterans jobs training programs, infrastructure, small business tax cuts, unemployment insurance reform. The gentleman referenced those on the floor. Clearly, there ought to be some areas where we can get agreement. Yesterday, as the gentleman may have noted, on the floor, on the debate, I asked that we were debating a regulatory bill that would have no immediate effect on jobs. Your contention is it would depress jobs in the future if that rule were adopted, but I don't think there was any contention during the time of the debate that that would create jobs. Having said that, I am wondering whether the gentleman has any intention of bringing either the President's jobs bill or a jobs bill that your side would offer, or a jobs bill that the President has offered to the American people and to this Congress, which would be open for amendment and change by your side and by our side in an effort to respond to the American people's great concern that we are not taking actions which are effectively growing jobs in this country. And I'll yield to my friend.
Thank the gentleman for all that information. And
I knew you'd be happy to receive it.
And just say to the gentleman, in quoting Moody's analysis, perhaps of what he portrays as our way forward, Moody's chief economist was also the one that made the prediction of an unemployment rate that would not exceed 8% as a result of passage of the stimulus bill. And it makes my point, Mr. Speaker, that the people in this country are tired of Washington making promises it doesn't keep. And we're trying to abide by the trust that the people put in us to try and deliver results. And right now, as the gentleman correctly points out, the economy is in bad shape. We are trying to do all we can to not only put money in people's pockets, because if there were unlimited money, that would be fine. But what we're trying to do is to encourage investment. We're trying to encourage economic activity so we can see growth happen and occur and jobs created. That's the way it's done in America, is that we need the private sector to take hold of a signal from Washington that we do believe in free enterprise, that we're not about this government dictating where activity must occur, where and who is deserving of government support. I mean, this is the essence, I think, of our difference, Mr. Speaker, and we're trying to set aside the divide, because clearly we don't agree with the President's approach thus far. We didn't agree with the stimulus approach, and I think the facts have borne out that we were right, that stimulus spending out of this government did not produce the results that the administration promised. We believed then and we believe now the key to economic growth going forward is to is to increase the confidence, is to bolster the entrepreneurial private sector in this country. It's about innovation. From innovation comes jobs, comes manufacturing. But we need to get Washington out of the way and out of the business of creating harm. And, you know, the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, quotes all kinds of people, but I can quote my constituents, as I'm sure many of his go to him and say, can you stop making it so difficult for us to run or create a business? We need to be a startup country again, Mr. Speaker, and we need to see that type of economic activity. That's what will bring on growth. And so what we've said is, no, the President's all-or-nothing approach is unacceptable. It has been rejected by the American people. They don't want the my way or highway kind of conduct. And what we see out there, Mr. Speaker, is some conduct on the part of the administration that is just not becoming of a helpful mode. How is it helpful out there to aim at particular sectors of industry, to aim at business in general when we're wanting the businesses to create the jobs? So what we've said is no, we're not for voting on tax increases in this House, which is what the President's proposal is about. We're not for accepting his desire to make it more difficult for charities to be successful. That's what's in the President's plan. I'm sure the gentleman would not agree that we ought to limit deductions to charity, and that's what the President's bill does, something that's not very helpful in today's economy, but when people are so in need of help by charities. So we said, fine, set aside those differences and let's work on where we can agree. So we said we'll bring the trade agreements to the floor. We've been asking for that, as has the gentleman. And I will say, Speaker, he has been a stalwart of trying to help get those bills through. And I appreciate that, as do many of the members on both sides who support free and fair trade. But I would say we also take note of the President's remarks in his speech to the joint session, where he said he would support our efforts in regulatory relief so that we can make it easier. We can make it easier for people going into business in a sensible way. We continue to bring bills forward on that note every week. We brought 2 forward this week, and as I indicated earlier, we'll again next week. We will also be bringing forward the 3% withholding bill at the end of October that the gentleman well knows is a big concern to not only the private sector, but also to institutions like public universities, who've already come and approached me and said, you know what, if you don't do something to remove that requirement, we're going to end up having to pay more for our contracts to our vendors. So we're bringing that bill to the floor. We also are having bills that will come out of the Financial Services Committee that echo what the President said in his speech to us, that echo the President's desire, stated desire, to want to help small businesses access financing. We've got to make sure we're doing everything there so it's not so difficult. We also intend to bring forward measures towards helping small businesses take advantage of their expenses so they can expense the cost that they incur to grow their businesses, and take advantage of that to see if we can grow. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, you know, the gentleman indicates we need to have hearings and we need to do things on the President's jobs bill. I think we've indicated again, the Ways and Means Committee today had hearings related to unemployment insurance reform, something the President indicated he wanted to do. So, Mr. Speaker, no, we're not going to bring up the President's bill in whole because we don't believe in raising taxes and in more stimulus spending. But we are going to take the parts that we can agree on. And we have taken that posture again and again. It's a reasoned approach when you have two sides that have disagreement to say we're going to focus on commonality and transcend those differences. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. First of all, let me say that the gentleman knows full well that the President's jobs bill does not include revenues. The President suggested in the short term, we ought not to raise revenues, as a matter of fact. In the short term, what we need to do is put more money back in people's pockets. The jobs bill, he did suggest ways to pay for that and he suggested, as did Bowles-Simpson and Rivlin-Domenici, that be paid for in the coming years so that we do not dampen down the economy at the same time we are trying to stimulate the economy. The gentleman says that the bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, didn't work, and he comments was the economy is in bad shape. Yes, the economy is in bad shape. It started being in bad shape in 2007, as the gentleman knows, when we went into the deepest recession he and I have experienced in our lifetime. And it remained in place, and the year that this president took office, we lost 786,000 jobs that month. After we passed the Recovery Act, as the gentleman knows, I'm sure, we created 2 million jobs over the last 24 months. The fact of the matter is, it worked. Unfortunately, almost no economist understood the depth to which the recession had taken us. So that the gentleman didn't support the Recovery Act, I understand that, nor did his party. Perhaps those 2 million jobs would not have been created. In fact, there was another bill, of course, the gentleman hates history, I know, that was passed that created 22 million jobs that no Republican supported. So I tell you, my friend, that when we compare economic performance of policies, one has created a lot of jobs and one lost a lot of jobs in the last decade. And I will tell my friend, when he says the American people don't support the jobs bill, in fact, I want to tell my friend the Washington Post ABC News poll says 52% of Americans support the American Jobs Act. 58% of Americans believe the American Jobs Act will improve the job situation, including in that number 52% of independents. In the Gallup poll, Americans support Obama's plan to pay for American Jobs Act. 70% of Americans support increasing taxes on some corporations by eliminating certain deductions. I think that some of your Republicans have said the same thing. 66% support increasing revenues on individuals earning at least $200,000. Now, again, the President did not suggest doing that now, as the gentleman knows, just as the commissions did not suggest doing that now. But what I have said to the gentleman, and what I believe to be the case, he says Ways and Means had a hearing today. That hearing was not on a comprehensive jobs package. It was on a important issue, no doubt about that, but there has been no comprehensive effort to put together in the short term a bill which will bring jobs to Americans that they need now. The President's bill, we believe, will do that. We understand that there may be opposition. We also understand that there may be change. But there has been no vehicle brought to this floor since the President spoke over 2 weeks ago to allow this House to work its will. You may have the majority of votes on it, but let the American people see who wants to create jobs. And the gentleman says, we don't create jobs. He is exactly right in a certain sense, but in another sense, as he says, we create an environment in which jobs are created, in which the economy grows, in which people feel comfortable. Now, one of the things I want to say to my friend that I hope he would be for, my own belief is that one of the things that we can do will most raise confidence will to have the Select Committee of 12 come to an agreement on cutting $4 trillion over the next 10 years so that we can get the fiscal house in America in order, and to do so by a balanced approach with everything, all of our expenses and revenues on the table. I would hope my friend would join me in that, in urging the Select Committee to do that, because I frankly think that is the one thing we can do that will raise the most confidence, not only here at home among Americans, but around the world in America's ability to address tough questions. So I would urge my friend to try to come to an agreement with his committee chairs to have a comprehensive jobs bill brought to the floor whatever you think that jobs bill may be, and then allow us to offer amendments, have the House of Representatives work its will on that, and then secondly, to join in urging the Select Committee to work on getting us back to where we were in 2001 with a projected surplus in this country. I'm prepared to.
If I could just
I'll yield to my friend.
respond, Mr. Speaker. First of